Dude, thank you so much.
Brother James, thanks for coming to my home.
Absolutely. It's an honor to be here.
It's a joy to have you here. How was the cake?
The cake was delicious.
Oh.
So was the tea. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
You just released a new book, Subversive Sabbath.
I did, indeed.
This is your 9th book that you have edited or authored.
That feels right, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Quick question. You're the husband of one, the father of another.
Yes.
The pastor of a church here in inner southeast Portland.
Indeed.
A faculty member at least 2 prestigious universities. And now you're authoring your 9th book. All of that suggests that you're not actually taking any Sabbaths at all because you're producing an incredible amount of content. How are you getting all of this stuff done?
There's 2 answers to that question. The first would be that my my counselor would tell me that I'm over-functioning out of unhealed pain from my childhood, and that my content creation reflects more than anything a desire to do way more than any human being should be doing by this age. So there's the side of neuroses and broken heart stuff that I'm still healing from. But the truth is, this book almost killed me. I mean, this book took 3 years of my life. My wife and Quinn and I have been keeping a Sabbath for about 10 years. And this book, it took 3 years to write the thing, and ironically, I almost burned out writing it. I mean, it almost killed me. But it needed to be done, and I'm really glad that we were able to do it, and it's having an impact, and I praise God.
You've been keeping the Sabbath as a regular rhythm and habit within your particular life here, and have been building it into the life of your church as well.
Yes.
But writing a book like this, you mentioned in another talk that you gave that you took it upon yourself to read almost everything that had ever been written on the topic. That's no small undertaking. To be both theologian, scholar, and now pastor, and combining all 3 of those things into a given work. Give me a sense for what it was that was really the driving motivation behind why you nearly killed yourself in the pursuit of producing a book like this.
Yeah, well, I think there were two foundational stories that took place in our church that really provoked me to write this book. With that said, 10 years ago when Quinn and I started to actually keep a rhythm of the Sabbath, we did it because of our own personal kind of almost burnout experience. We were in pastoral ministry and we're working about 80 hours a week, and it just almost killed us. But about 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, I began to notice at our own church, which we had planted 8 years ago, Theophilus, we planted it, the church was getting real tired. And I recognized that I had never preached on this stuff. I'd been doing it, but never talked about it. Sure. And part of it was I'd never articulated it for other people, and I didn't know how to. And 2 experiences kind of came out of that. The first was I decided to preach on it for 3 weeks in our church. So I preached for 3 Sundays on the topic of the Sabbath. And I have preached on a variety of things that have upset people.
Sure.
I've preached on sexuality, I've preached on abuse, I've preached on marijuana, I've preached on a variety of things that have not made me friends.
Yes.
And I decided to preach on the Sabbath, and I preached for 3 weeks on it. And the response revealed to me that this is a conversation churches need to start having, because we probably had, I don't think I've ever preached and had more people leave our church than when we talked about Sabbath, which was so interesting that the concept of rest could be so threatening to people.
Yeah.
And I think the second reason was I was in a church council meeting, which is the group of people that does the finances in the church. And I had one of the worst epiphanies of my entire life. And that was that, you take the 10 Commandments, these invitations into God, the life of God, and I had this epiphany that if I, broke 9 of those commandments and cheated on my wife or started preaching another gospel or, stole money, I'd probably end up losing my job.
Sure.
And had this epiphany that if I don't take a day of rest, I'll probably get a raise. And I think that killed me. I think that killed me because I knew that we have essentially created a church culture, with 9 commandments and 1 really strong suggestion. And at what point we thought that God was joking is beyond me. Like this, I think God really cares about this.
Yeah.
He does not care about it in a legalistic sense. We are called as Christians to keep a Sabbath in a Jesus-centered way, not in a law-centered way, in a Jesus-centered way.
Unpack that a little bit more. What's the key difference between those two ideas?
Well, Jesus' own interpretation of the Sabbath. There really are two ways of living the Sabbath, and that is one way in which we are, in essence, the slave, or the master is the Sabbath. Our job is to serve the master of the Sabbath.
Yeah.
The other way, which is Jesus' way, is that we do not serve the Sabbath serves us. Jesus said that I have not come, Jesus himself said that, the Sabbath was not given, you were not given to the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was given to you as a gift. And as a follower of Jesus, I do not keep the law to make God happy. I actually have already been found happy before God because of the work of Jesus. And out of that, it frees me to begin to do the principles of God. And so it's actually liberating to do the Sabbath in a Jesus-centered way, because it means that when I mess it up, my standing with God hasn't changed a lick. But legalism would say that your standing with God is dependent on doing the Sabbath properly and doing it right. And as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, my identity is wrapped up in the love of Jesus.
Exodus chapter 20.
By the way, Jesus kept a Sabbath. So if anybody's going to say that we are freed from the Ten Commandments, I would be the first to say that Jesus was unflinchingly committed to the commandments of the Father, the heart of God. But the difference is, there would be a lot of people that would be concerned about this conversation on the Sabbath and go, well, what does that mean? Now I can't eat bacon anymore? Or something like that. Sure. You're right, which I can assure everybody listening to this that I eat way too much bacon for anybody to suggest that I'm bringing back some kind of legalism. With the moral code of the Old Testament, which is the principles of God's heart for the world, have never changed. In fact, Jesus himself said that anybody that takes those things away will be called least in the kingdom of God. The purity laws, those friends, the bacon commandments, I'm free from. But the moral commands continue. Of the Ten Commandments, I would be curious to hear somebody make the case that the whole murder thing is just Old Testament. Like, we don't need to worry about that anymore. Or the whole, don't worship another God. That's it. We're in the 21st century. Why can we do that? I mean, it's interesting that nobody will ever say, I don't want to get too legalistic about the whole murder thing. Like, nobody ever does that. We only do it about the Sabbath. So interesting. We are so selective about which parts of the moral code in the Bible that we want to attend to.
Fascinating.
By the way, it's in creation. It's interesting when you go back to Genesis 1 and 2, that the Sabbath commandment actually comes way before God says don't murder, way before God says anything. God, the first invitation is to the day of rest. And by the way, Adam and Eve were made on day 6. The Sabbath was on day 7. It should blow our minds to recognize that Adam and Eve's first day of existence was a day of rest. It is the gospel, it is the way God works, and that is that God always invites humans to the rest first, and out of that to get the work done.
I think that a lot of Christians say the Sabbath, it first shows up in Exodus chapter 20 there with the Ten Commandments, but you're arguing that there is a creational undertone.
Menuha, that's the Hebrew word for rest in Genesis 1 and 2. And you can't get one page in the Bible without God inviting people to rest. It is the heartbeat of God. And by the way, so it's rooted in creation. And the point of that would be, if you take the 7 days of creation, if you were to remove one of those days, for example, let's say that we didn't need light anymore. God took all the light away. How would things work? It wouldn't last for very long. If you took away all the green things, it wouldn't last very long. You took away all the animals, probably wouldn't last very long. You take away anything from this finely tuned, created order, and it's going to start falling apart. Why do we think the Sabbath is any different? To not rest is actually to live a genetically modified life. It is to live in a way that God never intended us to live.
We see the Sabbath demonstrated on page 1 of the Bible. God commands or invites his people into a place of rest, and then from there to go out and do the work of tending the garden. Then fast forward into the Exodus event, which I think, as you pointed out before, is God first liberates, gives them rest from their captivity, and then gives them his law, which is then, and then Sabbath is then enshrined in the law. What would you say, as we synthesize both like Genesis 1 and 2 and Exodus 20, what picture, what composite do we see of God with respect to Sabbath out of those two images?
There was a little book written by Francis Schaeffer back in the 1980s called No Little People. It actually was a compendium of his sermons. Francis Schaeffer, of course, was a very well-known evangelical theologian and philosopher. It had a big impact on me. He had this little book, this little sermon where he talks about the Ark of the Covenant. And when you look at the Ark of the Covenant consists of, which is that gold box that God's people would carry around with them wherever they went, is that inside the box were the Ten Commandments. So it's the law of God. But on top of it was this thing called the mercy seat. Now, the mercy seat, so you have these two components. The mercy seat was the place where they would literally sprinkle the blood from the sacrifices. That would be the place where God met his people and the law was inside. And Francis Schaeffer has this little section in one of his sermons where he says that if you were a priest in the Old Testament, you would understand that the only way to get to the law was you had to go through the mercy seat. You never got to the mercy seat by going through the law. And his point is Jesus did not free us from the precepts of God's heart. But Jesus does not free us from the moral commands that are implicit in Scripture. But we can never get to God's grace through them. We can only get to them through God's grace. That changes the Sabbath conversation, because I'm actually not saved by doing the Sabbath. I'm saved to Sabbath. I think the entire heartbeat of God is that people who are at rest with God can actually rest on this planet. It is not that our rest here creates rest with God. I'm not saved. I don't keep the Sabbath to get saved. I am saved, and out of that keep the Sabbath. Which, incidentally, anybody that reads the end of the Bible or the book of Hebrews finds that actually our future is the Sabbath. We don't get to go to heaven because we keep the Sabbath, but it just so turns out that heaven will be the condition, Sabbath will be the condition of heaven when we do get there. So our future is Sabbath. Our future is rest before God.
And if we're going to be kingdom-minded people, then we had better start inaugurating that aspect.
Right now. Abram Heschel, who's a Jewish rabbi, theologian, wrote probably the most important book on the Sabbath in the last 2,000 years outside of, there's a number of great writings, but this is probably the most important one. And he says that a Sabbath day, to take a day of week of rest, is eternity uttering a day. It is, in essence, if I was to translate that heaven, taking a day of rest here, is to practice the new heaven and the new earth. It is to actually begin the process of God's reign and rule being here in the world. And I can tell you, living in this neighborhood, inner Southeast Portland, the Sabbath doesn't make any sense to anybody. It is the weirdest thing in the world. And our neighbors all know that we do it. Like, they know that we Sabbath. In a world where everybody is exhausted and fragmented, that there's somebody in the neighborhood that does something weird and countercultural, speaks volumes about what we believe. So I think a Christian's job, keep the Sabbath weird. Keep it weird. Because we're not called to be normal. We're not called to be people. We're called to be Daniels who live in Babylon and don't eat the food.
The distinctiveness of the Christian can be expressed through Sabbath.
Absolutely. It is a point of witness to the world of God's kingdom here and now, because I do not worship the lords that you worship.
Fascinating. I think that's a really important point, because my next question is in regards to I have a tendency towards workaholism, and I enjoy my work, and so I often find myself drawn to it on my quote-unquote day off. And there's a sense of drive that I have, that there's much work to be done, so we better get on doing it. What counsel would you give to someone who is on board, who sees the theological argument, but stumbles in the practical application of it?
Two observations that I would make in writing this book. Two things. Number one is, I have never met anybody who accidentally kept the Sabbath. So I've never met anybody who just woke up and was like, I don't know what happened. I kept a day of rest. Secondarily, I've never met anybody who used to take a Sabbath. Meaning, once you start doing it, I think it's pretty hard to go back. Like, it becomes so central to it. It's like learning how to breathe for the first time. You're like, wow, that's really nice when you actually learn how to breathe. Workaholism is a really hard thing. And the reason workaholism is really hard is workaholism is very different than, say, for example, alcoholism. Okay, why is it different? Well, for an alcoholic, when a person figures out that they're an alcoholic, you don't generally learn how to live in the right relationship with alcohol. You cut your relationship off. Relationship is over. So you never teach an alcoholic to be like, let's teach you to have the right relationship with alcohol, and this number of drinks a day, and this number. No. Generally speaking, alcoholics you have to be done. You can't continue. Workaholism is very different because when you recognize you're a workaholic, you don't just get to quit tomorrow and be like, I'm not going to work anymore.
Early retirement. Sign
Exactly.
me up.
It's done. It's very different. And workaholism is something that we probably all are on some level.
Yeah.
And the difficult thing is we can't just quit. I mean, these are our livelihoods, and we've got to eat. We've got to sleep and have places to live. And I don't think the Sabbath is an invitation to laziness. When you read Exodus 20, it is not only an invitation to rest, it is simultaneously an invitation to work.
Yeah.
In fact, God is clear. It says you need to work 6 days a week and take a day of rest a week.
Yeah.
It is not an invitation to laziness. In fact, the Bible's word for rest without work is laziness. But the Bible also has a word for work without rest, and that's slavery. And what we need to learn is that the Sabbath is actually an invitation to learn to work well. It is not an invitation to stop working. It is an invitation to have boundaries in your work. Because if we don't have boundaries in our work, it will take our life over. And what will happen is exactly what God said will happen. You will work the land, and it will create thistles and thorns.
Yeah. There's a principle that says that work expands to fill the time allotted to it.
Yes, yes.
And I'm wondering if that same principle is here in play, where when we build our lives around this weekly routine of work and then rest, that we know that we don't have the luxury of letting this work kind of bleed into the next day or that sacred space, and it makes us far more effective than had we just blown the doors off and say, I'm going to hustle from sun up to sundown, when in reality we're not making the best use of the time that's been given.
Yeah, interestingly, this is where science comes to play. There have been a number of studies done on this question of productivity, and it actually turns out that there is a point of, what do you call it? The law of diminishing returns, as it were. Mm-hmm. That if you work 7 days a week, so if you work 5 days a week and you work really hard, there's a certain level of productivity. You work 6 days, it probably keeps going up.
Yeah.
But there's something about working 7 days a week where your productivity starts going down. It's almost like the Bible's right.
It's almost
like God knew what he was talking about.
Sure.
That our productivity actually decreases when we work 7 days a week because we don't have space in our hearts and minds to do it well. And by the way, multitasking is a complete myth.
Yes.
Nobody actually does it.
Yeah.
Your mind and our mind, science has been telling us for years, we literally cannot multitask. We can only do one thing at a time. And I call it monogamy of attention. That I am not, as it were, I'm not loose with my attention. I'm really cautious and careful about what I give my attention to. Which is really hard because it means that you have to have the ability to say no. Eugene Peterson actually says that overwork, the root sin of overworking is actually laziness, sloth. And here's why. Because when we overwork, it's because we do not have the guts and the strength to say no to stuff.
Fascinating.
So he says that the root sin of overworking is sloth, which I think is completely accurate.
I read his contemplative pastor book early on, and it rocked me because he did a couple of things I found fascinating. He endeavored early on in his ministry to never pastor a church larger than the number of people whose first names he could remember. And so somehow, Eugene Peterson, a famous pastor, 300 people in his church, something like that.
Yeah.
And he said to get to your calendar before anyone else does, because the one kind of unassailable excuse for not showing up to that thing is, I have a prior commitment.
Yeah.
And he says, if that prior commitment is with you and Jesus, put it on the calendar. If it's with you and your spouse, and you don't have to explain why, it's just, I have a prior commitment. And that rocked me.
It's important wisdom.
It's true.
Yeah, saying no is, I have noticed with millennials and Gen Zers, they're calling them now, which is the generation after the millennial generation, which they were called Gen X and then we transitioned to millennials, now it's Gen Zers. I've observed that none of them know how to RSVP for anything.
No.
Like, they are the maybe generation.
Yeah.
So they'll do I might show up.
Yep.
And the reason, at the end of the day, I'm not belittling millennials, but the reason at the end of the day is when you have the kinds of opportunities that you have an exhaustive amount of opportunities.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
We don't say yes because we're always protecting our ability to go to the best gig. Yes. We're looking for the best gig to go to. And because we're looking for the best gig to go to, we don't know how to say no to anything. So we would rather not hurt feelings on the front end, and just be the maybe people.
Yeah.
And there's something dangerous in that.
Yeah.
I feel a sense of pain from millennials for that, because I think that there's an anxiety of opportunity. Too many opportunities create anxiety. Listen, when our grandparents were kids, they didn't have a choice about what they were going to do generally. They worked the farms, they got up at 5 in the morning, milked the cow, they were given what their life is going to be about. And now, we can do anything we want to do.
Yeah.
I mean, it's that myth of that millennial standing in a grocery store who's looking at the cereal that will fulfill their life. And they just can't decide. They're just wandering from row to row to row.
Yeah.
There's this anxiety of opportunity.
Yeah, paralysis.
And exactly. We're paralyzed by opportunity. And the Sabbath frees us from that. It frees us from thinking that life consists in getting the best stuff on the calendar. Sometimes the Sabbath, I mean, at the end of the day, the Sabbath, I don't get everything I want. I am forced, as Psalm 22, He makes me lie down. I mean, I don't really have a choice. I have to lie down. There's no paralysis of choice on the Sabbath. I am called by God to just be present in.
In your book, you'll argue that Sabbath keeping has a social justice component. Connect those two concepts for us.
Oh man, yeah. Yeah, there's an old rabbinic saying that says the one who invented the Sabbath is the one who most loves the poor. The one who invented the Sabbath most loves the poor. When we read Genesis and then eventually Exodus 20, for that matter, the first 5 books of the Bible, and even further on, we find that the Sabbath Commandment has a direct implication for people who are in poverty and for refugees, for aliens. When you read Exodus 20, you'll notice that the commandment is that the Sabbath day is for you. It's for your manservants, for your maidservants. It's for your animals. It's funny that even farms are included.
Yeah.
And then he says, for the alien in your midst. And he's talking about refugees. And when you take that theme and you play it out through the entire Bible, the Sabbath is intended not just to be for those in privilege. It is intended to be for everybody.
Yeah.
In fact, when you go back to Genesis 1 and 2, Genesis 1 and 2 tells us that not only is man invited to the Sabbath, but the woman is invited to the Sabbath as well. And by the way, in an ancient world where women were basically seen as footnotes, as mistakes, as errors, any reader in the first, when they would have read that, would have gone, women get it too? Meaning, it's not the dude's day to just relax in the man cave while the woman's in the cave. While the woman's in the kitchen.
Yeah.
Like, it is for both people.
Yeah.
It is not just for the dude. I mean, that theme is throughout the entire Bible. If my Sabbath is somebody else's slavery, then I'm not Sabbathing. Now, I have a lot of feelings about these organizations. Okay, I'm a classic Portlander, so I'm trained to have all sorts of thoughts. But I think about Hobby Lobby and Chick-fil-A.
Sure.
And you look at the way they run their organizations. Chick-fil-A and Hobby Lobby shut down 1 day a week so that people can go home and be with their families. And those two organizations, Hobby Lobby, Chick-fil-A, again, I can have all sorts of feelings about those organizations, but those two organizations lose billions and billions of dollars every year so that people can go home and be with their families. And to me, if they weren't to do that, there would be a lot of people that pay a price. I am a fairly middle-class guy in Portland who, my bills are paid. And I think, and I'm a pastor, and that means I have a staff that's accountable to me. And I have pastors' wives and pastors' husbands that are accountable to them, people that are accountable to each other. And I can tell you this. When I sit down with my staff and I tell them, you need to Sabbath, there's a structural freedom that's given to them, where it's not just, it's actually part of their job. If I don't, I have a youth pastor that I'm working with in New York City right now, who is burning out. He is done. He is about 30 years old. He is 100 pounds overweight. His heart is giving up on him, and he works 88, 90 hours a week. And when he goes to his senior pastor, who, by the way, has never kept a day of Sabbath in his entire life, and he goes to him and says, I need to take a day of rest.
Sure.
What do you think his pastor says? His pastor says, why would you ever need it? I never needed it. When people in power who have the ability to make decisions don't keep the Sabbath, they will project their workaholism on everybody else. And at the end of the day, I think that when the poor cannot rest until the rich start doing it. We need to stop 1 day a week, not just for ourselves, but for everybody else. Does that connect the dots?
Very much so. You also make the argument about the relationship between Sabbath and creation care.
Yes.
Okay.
Caring for creation. Yes.
Help us understand how those two things
Yeah. Interestingly enough, this is a part of the book that I know I'm going to get crucified for because it's the minute you care for creation, you're sort of written off as this liberal tree hugger.
Sure.
And I'm not a tree hugger. I'm sorry, I'm a tree hugger, but it's more like a side hug.
Yeah.
So I love you, but I don't worship you. I wish honestly that people would read their Bibles more because at the end of the day, just our biblical illiteracy. The only reason you can say somebody's liberal by caring for creation is honestly to write the Bible off. Right. I mean, from beginning to end in this book, there is no religious book in the world that starts with a garden. Name one other religion that starts in a garden, and name one other religion when the God of that religion is resurrected and the people who first see him think he's a gardener.
Yeah.
Jesus, and by the way, when Mary saw that a gardener was there, she wasn't wrong.
Yeah.
Because God is a gardener. The very first thing God does in Genesis 1 is he creates a garden. Okay. Creation care is not can it be hijacked by ideologies? You bet your sweet bippy it can. I've seen it happen. You've seen it happen. I'm not called to be faithful to the world's ideology. I'm called to be faithful to the Bible.
Sure.
And this book tells me that creation care matters to God. When God said, take her to the garden, there was no point where he said, just kidding.
Sure.
God cares about it.
Sabbath. I want to interject here because I don't want to have this be misconstrued as though like cultural advancement and city building and statecraft and all of the things that go on with civilization building is somehow antithetical. And correct me here if I'm wrong.
The Bible begins a garden and ends in a city.
Yeah. And I think both of those things are held in tension where I think what Tim Keller says that like man's original call was to take the natural order of creation and repurpose it, reorganize it for human flourishing and the good of all. And so there is a place for the literal gardening of the earth, but also for the responsible, the building of this civilized world as we see it, culminating in a city with a garden within it.
My only pushback, thank you for that, only pushback is that human-centered arguments for creation care are, in my opinion, human-centered.
Sure.
And at the end of the day, any human-centered approach is humanity saying to God, I want to be like you. And we are not the center of this creation. Jesus Christ is the center of this creation. We live a Christ-centered approach. And that means this is all for him. The new heaven and the new earth is for him. We are part of his story. He's not a part of our story. And what that does for me, which is important, it's not human-centered, it's Christ-centered. And because it's Christ-centered, that means that I have an obligation to care for all the other things that God cares for. And God cares for, it turns out, as Jesus tells us, the sparrows. God cares for everything he has made. In fact, in John 3, when John describes, for God so loved the world, the word cosmos, which is the Greek word, is all of creation. It is not just humanity. It is everything God has made. Are human beings unique in the creation order? Absolutely. We are made on day 6, and we reflect the image of God in a way that nothing else in creation does. But this is not a man-made or a man-centered environment. This is a Jesus-centered environment.
Fascinating. So
Colossians 1, his love holds all things together. My friend Nate Petzel, who's a Foursquare pastor, wrote his master's thesis arguing that literally when physicists look at an atom and have absolutely no idea why it doesn't just explode, that it's literally the love of God that's holding all things together.
If we take the idea that creation care, environmentalism broadly is a uniquely and fatally liberal idea, but rather it's
a biblical idea.
It's a biblical idea to its core, then how does Sabbath keeping accentuate our capacity to care for creation?
Well, I'm going to go back to Exodus 20 here. It turns out that there is explicit biblical commands to Sabbath for the sake of your animals. So, for example, not just the animals. Let me go even further than that. We have all in Leviticus, all of these sabbatical laws, commandments around why you Sabbath and let the land go fallow every 7 years, every 50 years. Why do we do that? Why do we let the land go fallow? Why? Well, it turns out when you don't let the land go fallow, The ability of the soil to give you what you want can't handle it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so fascinating that, by the way, modern agricultural practice, which is to give the land rest every 7 years, it turns out it comes straight from the Bible. Yeah. Again, it turns out the Bible's actually right, that the best principles come out of Scripture. This Sabbath stuff is not an invitation for us to not work the land and care for it. It is so that the land can produce the best stuff for us, sure. Right? At the end of the day. Listen, we have 6 chickens. And I can tell you this. I've noticed that we take our Sabbath on Saturday. I've noticed that they love the Sabbath. And here's why. Number 2, we give them extra food on Friday. And on Sunday, when we come back, they've laid way more eggs than they normally do. And what I've observed is they love a day free from their human people. And they get a day to just be themselves and hang out. And they're not going to produce anything for us. And I know it sounds nerdy, but I think our chickens love the Sabbath. And when I go out on Friday and I give them extra food, they know it. They're like, oh, Friday's here! The Sabbath is coming! They know it. At the end of the day, I wonder if creation is breaking down because it's just exhausted. We don't give it a break.
Yeah.
We don't give anything a break because we're workaholics.
Yeah. There's several popular figures in the internet. I'm thinking of Casey Neistat and Gary Vaynerchuk. These are 2 entrepreneurs, New York City based. Neistat has a tattoo on his forearm that says "Work Harder." Vaynerchuk is famous for kind of creating a new mythology around the concept of hustle. And it seems there's a whole kind of, each of these have millions of followers, and they're neither of them are spiritual people in the least as far as I can discern, but they're, if you will, developing their own church. And they have their disciples and their followers. And it's in vogue, I think, to kind of see these people and see this idea that the answer to your economic plight as millennials is to distinguish yourself by working harder. What would you say in response?
Well, millennials on average do work fewer hours than baby boomers do their parents. There's no question that there's a generational shift. I had a boomer pastor come to me after I gave a talk on this very topic of the Sabbath, and he said, I feel really uncomfortable bringing my millennial pastors to this meeting. And I said, why? I said, because I don't think millennials need to be told how to rest because they're doing it really well. And I looked at him and I said, well, the truth is, you're a baby boomer, they're millennials, they work less. And the reason that they work less is honestly because you work 7 days a week and they saw the way that you live and they don't want anything to do with it.
As a response.
So I think there's a generational shift with millennials. They pulled back the throttle a little bit to say, like, I don't want to burn out the way my parents did. I don't want to do that to myself. So I think there's a little bit of that. But the flip side would be, listen, the Sabbath is not an invitation to not be productive. Being productive is really important. Being productive and getting things done needs to happen. Get your work done. We need to work hard.
Sure.
But there is a level at which our productivity ceases to be working and becomes worshiping working.
Ooh.
There's a big difference between those two. And in fact, Mary Bell is a cultural theorist. She says the alcohol of our time is workaholism. Is that it is the thing that gives us our new sense of identity, right? That we cover ourselves with the new fig leaf, and it is productivity. That we cover ourselves with feeling like we are accomplishing everything. I mean, even after there was a recent shooting, another high school shooting, and what happens when people say they're going to pray for the thing? Well, it turns out that you can't pray anymore. That is not an effective way to accomplish things in this world. The only way you're allowed to act is you have to be an activist. You have to get things done. You have to call your senators. And what's really sad about that is in an activist world, stopping and being before the Lord is not considered a valuable activity. And I think the Sabbath in an activist world, keeping a Sabbath is heresy. In a world that's breaking down and falling apart, you're going to take a day and stop?
Yeah.
And we've got to resist that because we don't worship activity as a way to get things done. We worship Jesus who gets things done. Yeah. And we work hard and we work 6 days a week and we get our stuff done. But it is so interesting that in the Bible, God creates the world and then rests on day 7. Did he do it because he was exhausted? No. He did it because he's a good model.
Yeah.
When God creates the world, he takes a day of rest as he finishes creation. As Jesus, who is the Son of God, comes into the world and recreates the world, what does he do on day 7?
Yeah.
He sits in a borrowed tomb.
Yeah.
And he's dead. It's interesting to me. Every time God wants to create or recreate, he takes a nap. He takes a day off. He stops. And I think there's a lesson in that. And the lesson is that God's work, or God's rest, is always more effective than man's work. Always. That what God can do in a day of rest, man couldn't do in eternity.
Yeah.
And we have got to resist the urge to think that our activity is everything. It turns out that God, when he looks at Adam and Eve after they sin, God looks at Adam and Eve and says, you're going to work the land. And it's gonna. Sandra Richter's an Old Testament professor, and she says the verb is fear-inducing or inducing, anxiety-inducing perspiration. It is working so hard that's just out of anxiety. It's not out of freedom, it's out of anxiety. And God knew the minute we sinned, we would turn our work into our new God. And we've done that.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of victims of us turning our work into our God.
Yeah.
I can tell you this, for pastors, there's a whole generation of PKs in this world who hate the church because of that. Because they see the church as having stolen their moms and their dads from them. We say we don't believe in child sacrifice. But we do. And we put our children on the altar all the time for our work. And people pay the price for if we do not work appropriately. So at the end of the day, I heard this one talk, I think it was Ravi Zacharias, he was talking to a Muslim scholar at one point. And he was saying, when Abram took his son Isaac up on the mountain, and he was about to sacrifice him, thinking that was what God wanted him to do. And then God said, stop. Ravi has this comment where he says, if you don't have a God who speaks to you, you will always, always put your child on the chopping block. And I think that what the story of God does in the Bible is that God always provides his own sacrifice.
Yeah.
And that we don't have to put our kids and the things that we value the most on the chopping block. We actually are free to love those things because God has paid the price in his son Jesus.
That's amazing. Let's wrap up. Any final thoughts or words of encouragement?
No, buy the book. Here it is. Subversive Sabbath. I poured my heart and soul into it, and I hope it's a blessing to anybody that reads it. And the truth is, I don't know if I've ever written anything that I believe in as much as I do this, and because I think that we are exhausted, and that we need to learn that God actually cares about us, not as slaves. We are not slaves. We are his friends. Grace and peace. Thanks for having me. Yep.
Well, I've still got you here.